Hello and welcome to Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. I'm your host, Paul George. Living like we do in the heart of Silicon Valley, we are very aware of the benefits and the drawbacks of technology, of our modern technology. We're already seeing, for an example, a highly negative impact on housing costs in the area. But what about the impact of ever-increasing automation in the workplace? Where are people going to find jobs and earn paychecks? Well, there's a common sense idea that is being given some very serious consideration right now. It's the idea of a guaranteed basic income for everyone. And that's what we're going to talk about this month on Other Voices. And joining me to help us understand about a universal basic income, I'm very pleased to welcome to Other Voices SANDYHA ANANTHARAMAN. I finally get on air and I blow it. SANDYHA ANANTHARAMAN and Jim PUGH, both co-directors with the Universal Income Project. Jim and SANDYHA, welcome to Other Voices.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us, Paul.
So usually I ask an organization to, when people are here from an organization, to describe their organization first, but I'm going to save that till last because that ties in with how do we get there. But let's start with basic definitions. And I know there are a lot of definitions for universal basic income. That's something we want to talk about. But let's start with the basic definition. What is a universal basic income?
So universal basic income is a cash payment that goes to everyone that they receive every month that's actually enough to cover their basic needs. So things like food, housing, clothing. It's at a level that actually will allow you to get by from that money to be able to exist on a basic level.
And so this is regardless of whether you said everyone. So if you have a job or you don't have a job.
This is the kind of program that it's not means tested, right? There's absolutely no conditions in terms of who you have to be, what you do, what your lifestyle is in terms of whether you receive it. And, you know, the unique thing is that there's also no conditions on how you spend it, right? This is a program that is really individually targeted to make sure people are able to meet their needs because it's delivered in the form of cash. So, you know, when we think about all of the different hurdles people might face here in the Bay Area, for example, you know, some people may need help with housing. Some folks may need help with basic needs like food and clothing. Others may need help with things like childcare or transportation, right? So what a universal basic income does is ensure that we have this, you know, fundamental platform upon which people have to rest. It's money, as Jim said, that comes regularly, that you can count on because it's something that's delivered at the beginning of the month, every month, to make sure that they can really plan for the future and know that they have a sense of stability no matter what.
All right, and no means testing.
Yeah,
Everybody
exactly.
gets it. Everybody gets the same amount.
That's right.
Okay. It's a pretty simple idea, pretty radical idea, I would think. For people who haven't heard about this before, it is by no means a new idea, though, is it?
Basic income has actually been really at the forefront of politics in American history. That if you look back to conversations in the 60s and early 70s, there were serious proposals for enacting a basic income in the United States. Even during the Nixon administration, there was actually legislation that almost made it through Congress that would have established a form of basic income here in the US. It was an idea that was actually championed by Martin Luther King. It was part of the Black Panthers platform as to what they thought everyone in the country should deserve. So it really was a major part of the conversation if you go back 5 decades, but then it kind of died out in the years following that and only has recently reemerged.
Why is it reemerging now? Because of the automation and other modern economic pressures like that, or?
Yeah, you know, I think what automation is doing is really forcing us to take a step back and consider how we can guarantee stability for folks, right? Because if you think about the way that we've kind of counted on our system being set up 30 or 40 years ago, if you went to college or even if you didn't, you could be guaranteed to get a job at one company, work your way up, right? That company would both provide you with a steady income, enough to feed your family, also with rights like healthcare, pay off if you even had those. Yeah. They would help you make sure that you were saving for retirement, and often you would get a pension plan when you retired. So it was really like we were counting on companies to make sure that they were taking you from school to retirement safely and securely. And for a number of reasons, that's started to really fracture over the last couple of decades, right? We're seeing our GDP go up, but average Americans aren't sharing in that increased wealth anymore.
Right.
And because
Wages
of
are not increasing. They're
exactly,
stagnant. Yeah.
exactly. And forces like automation are making it so people are working more jobs, they're working more part-time jobs, they're consulting or contracting. So all of these systems at full-time companies that used to provide stability in all these other areas have kind of disappeared for a lot of folks. So I think what automation is doing is really forcing us to reconsider what this social contract looks like, right? How do we make sure that folks can meet their basic needs? Because our old system doesn't apply to the workforce today, let alone the workforce in 20 years. And so that's why I think this conversation about basic income is coming back up, because at the end of the day, we're an incredibly wealthy country, right? Yeah. And so why not implement a really simple system to make sure that absolutely everyone can meet their basic needs?
So I guess the big question is, how does this get paid for? So is there, I imagine there's all kinds of ideas about how to do that, but is there kind of a general rule of thumb how these different systems might actually be financed?
There's a lot of different proposals out there as to how you might fund a basic income, but I think that brings up a really key point, which is so much of our modern and current political debate is really framed from an austerity perspective, that there's not enough to go around, that we have to think about what do we cut this year, what do we cut next year, and that's actually not reflective of the economy that exists today. To Sandhya's point earlier, if you look at GDP, it keeps going up, up, and up. The money is out there. We actually have so much wealth in this country. We've just decided at the political level, we're not going to prioritize using it to solve poverty.
Right.
And that is a choice, and it's a choice that we can change. So if we as a country decide this is something that we want to tackle, we absolutely have the funding to do it.
Yeah, it's political will is always the key here. It's one of the reasons that wages haven't increased in the last 20 years because of political decisions made in Washington and laws passed. And in terms of the available wealth, I think this is a good time to be talking about it because we're seeing Congress proposing to transfer $1.5 trillion from most of us to a very few of us, and that's no small chunk of change.
And what's fascinating is we're still hearing the same arguments as defenses. The reason that we are cutting into, subsidies for housing, the reason that we're cutting into food stamps programs with this tax bill, the arguments that congressmen are making are that we don't have enough money to pay for them, at the same time as we're seeing a fairly blatant transfer of money to the wealthy, right? Yeah. So this is, it feels like a really, really sort of on the nose example of what Jim is talking about. That the question of funding is not as much about whether we have the money or where it's coming from, because we can talk about different sources all the time. It's really about whether we think that we have the money to do it, right? Whether we are actually looking at the amount of wealth that we have and deciding who should get access to it.
Back to some basic questions about it. Is this just for adults, or would a household with 2 adults and 2 children get 4 basic incomes every month, or does that vary with different systems?
There are different proposals that exist as to whether children should receive it as well as adults, but an important thing is that it's at the individual level. So if you have a household with multiple people, every single person there is receiving a basic income. Yeah. And the version of basic income that we support, that we feel like would really champion progressive values, does actually give a basic income to children as well, making sure that everyone in our society is being valued through the program.
So you've got income from the moment you're born.
Exactly.
And you just got to trust mom and dad will do right things with it. Let's talk about some real-world examples. Again, I think a lot of people aren't even aware of this concept or just vaguely aware of it, let alone its history. But there are a number of places right now where it's being tried, and different systems are being experimented with to see how it could actually work. So I think it'd be helpful at this point to talk about some of those. And one is very local. Has focused a trial in Oakland, and this is being run by a Silicon Valley operation called Y Combinator.
Yeah, that's right. It's amazing to see the explosion of interest in experiments and pilots around this idea in just the last 2 years. So I think, I mean, you mentioned some of the pertinent examples. Finland is currently running a trial looking at replacing their unemployment program with unconditional cash stipends. So they're specifically looking at like a social safety net application. The province of Ontario in Canada is currently in the process of trialing a basic income in 3 different areas in the province. So individuals 18 to 64, I believe, will be receiving payments over the course of 3 years. And then they'll be looking to see what the impact is on a variety of indicators. So on work, on happiness, on stress levels, on food security. And then in Oakland, we have a pilot being run by Y Combinator. And this is the first sort of large-scale pilot in the US since the 1960s to look at the impact of cash. So what they're really seeking to understand is just what kind of freedoms will income security provide for folks. So they're taking 1,000 different people, they're doing a randomized control trial, and they will also be studying both quantitative and qualitative impacts. So, you know, gathering stories about the way that this impacts people, as well as looking at data about how they're spending it, how this affects their work time, et cetera.
Right. So now the Oakland is a follow-on. They've tried a small experiment there.
They're currently in the pilot phase. So it's interesting to consider, like, okay, you want to test giving people money. Well, there's actually a bunch of, how would you do that? Do you want to give them a debit card? Do you want to deposit money in their bank account? Do you want to send them a check? So they've actually been working through the logistics with the pilot so that they can figure out the best mechanism for, you know, actually implementing a 3 to 5 year trial. And the other one that we should mention is Stockton.
Stockton, California.
Stockton, California. So they are also doing a basic income pilot. Not exactly an experiment. They're looking to give 100 families something like $500 a month over the course of a year as a means to understand how these families' lives change. So this is a primarily qualitative pilot, right? They want to be able to tell these stories. They want to, you know, to be able to understand and then tell the rest of the country what having $500 a month that you can count on no matter what really looks like, especially in, you know, a place like the Bay Area.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think is important to emphasize, that oftentimes when we talk about pilots, the only thing we consider is the quantitative, is actually measuring how does that affect employment rate, how does that affect health numbers. I think a really important aspect of pilots is also going to be the stories that come out, because we've had this very intentional narrative crafted in the United States of how people who are struggling, who receive some sort of support, don't use it well, which is not borne out by any evidence. But that is the image people have. And if we can actually show concrete examples of how people's lives are being made better and how they're really taking that money and using it to do amazing things, that potentially can really help to combat some of those misconceptions.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, this narrative that we have around programs and the considerations of welfare is really pernicious, right? And it's a welfare that it's a narrative that was intentionally created to make people suspicious of giving support to folks who need it, right? And that's one of the main reasons that as a country we still haven't solved a problem that is not complicated to solve, right? It's not difficult to figure out how to get people out of poverty. It's making sure they have the resources to not be poor. But as Jim said, it's really about retelling the story of making sure that, you know, we don't mistrust folks who are poor. We just give them the resources to make sure that they're not anymore.
Yeah, we had a prime example of that just this week with Senator Charles Grassley talking about people wasting money on booze, women, and movies.
The 3 sins.
But that comes right out of that narrative that has been built up for so many years that you're talking about. Yeah, so you mentioned that I think it was Finland that you said is really kind of experimenting with replacing their unemployment system, and that one is more the quantitative. Will it increase employment? Will people stop looking for jobs? But was it Ontario that's going to do a much more comprehensive
Exactly.
quality assessment of how it impacts people's lives, reduces stress, and improves health? Do we have any studies of this sort of thing already to be able to point to and say a basic income has tremendous health outcomes, has tremendous stress outcomes, or whatever, quality of life?
So we do. We have a number of different past studies to look at on that front. There's been many studies at this point that have been done in developing nations of what the effects are of providing people with unconditional cash transfers and looking at what happens in their lives. So the charity Give Directly not only provides that philanthropic giving, but actually has done a number of experiments to better understand what impact that has.
And the group is called what again?
Give Directly.
Give Directly.
And they've generally seen that when you give people more support, when you give them cash, health improves, entrepreneurial engagement improves. Across the board, people seem to be doing quite a bit better. Closer to home, there was a pilot that was run back in the 70s in Canada, in the province of Manitoba. There was an entire town, actually, that everyone in the town was provided with what's called a negative income tax, which basically ensured that they were making a certain amount of money. And there wasn't any sort of...
Let's not just leave that there. A negative income tax, so if you're not making much money, rather than paying taxes, you're getting like a refund?
Exactly.
Okay.
So if you weren't earning anything, you would be given an amount that brings you up above the poverty level. As you earn more, that amount decreases, but it ensures you always are above the poverty level.
So that's not so much a basic income, because that almost sets a ceiling, doesn't it?
As you earn more, you still get more money. It just is, the initial money you're earning is effectively taxed at a higher rate,
Okay.
up until you hit a certain point, and then it's treated like any other income.
Okay.
What they found when they initiated this program in this town in Manitoba is that over the course of 4 years, when they looked at hospital records, they found that health outcomes improved significantly.
Wow.
People were getting sick less often. They found what initially seemed like a negative outcome, which was that there was a decrease in workforce. But when they looked closely, almost the entire decrease came from 2 different groups of people. The first was young people who were staying in school longer. And the second was secondary earners, typically women, who were staying home with children more. And so
not really negative impacts.
Right. Those are both outcomes that really could be very, very good for generally what happens in society.
Yeah.
So that was an example where we were able to see over multiple years what sort of impact a program like Basic Income had.
If they had such positive outcomes, I have to ask, why aren't they still doing it?
That's a great question. And I think it comes back to politics, right? So while they were in the midst of conducting this experiment, the administration for the province turned over to the opposing party, and they decided, you know what, we don't think that the research is really worth doing anymore. So we're going to cut off funding for that. We'll keep giving people money because we promised it to them. But they cut off the research. So they ended up collecting a certain amount of data, but there's this story of, 1,800 boxes, cardboard boxes, sitting in a warehouse collecting dust until like 2011, when this researcher named Evelyn Forget heard about this pilot and said, you know what, I would love to figure out a way that we could understand what happened. So it turns out by chance that Canada had implemented their universal healthcare system at the same time. So that's how she was able to use that universal healthcare data on how people were using the healthcare system and whether they were working to understand the impacts of this pilot in this town. So it happened to be that politically, the administration that came in didn't want to do this pilot anymore. And that's why the conversation kind of just died out. So, I think it really speaks to how important this thread that we've been talking about, right? This narrative, sort of how we're telling the story of where we want to go, how important that is to actually getting there.
Yeah. So these various experiments around the world that are going on right now, I take it they all have different structures, but who's funding those? The one for Oakland is Y Combinator is a Silicon Valley startup incubator, and they're providing like private financing
Yeah, so
for that project, right?
they have like
and
a
what
mix
was it?
of
3,000 people. You're gonna have in
it's
that?
3,000 people total. I think there's 1,000 people that are receiving some sort of some sort of basic income, and the other 2,000 will serve as a control.
Control. So they pick out 3,000 people, and a third of them get lucky and get the draw, and then
They're being very diligent and actually working with a number of university researchers to help advise to make sure that their experiment design is valid and that they'll actually be able to obtain data that they can use to assess broader implications there. And they're still in the process of figuring out where this is going to happen. The experiment itself won't all be in Oakland. They're looking at geographic diversity as part of the factor there as well.
yeah.
But they're raising funds right now in order to fund that experiment.
Since these are experiments and we have other laws in place right now, does it impact like somebody collecting their unemployment insurance or things like that?
That's been a major reason for why they started small with this pilot, because they needed to understand what are the possible ramifications and ensure that as they're doing this, they weren't accidentally penalizing people in some way that wasn't anticipated.
Yeah, 'cause
so that's
you're kinda
actually been a
running
major
two
point of consideration.
different systems
Exactly.
in real time on the different people. You mentioned Give Directly. Aren't they getting ready to start up a rather large project in Kenya?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So they, I think, have just finished almost completely fundraising for a 10-year basic income experiment.
10-year experiment.
Yeah, which is really incredible. So they'll be releasing results every 2 years. But essentially what they're doing is taking a number of villages and doing saturation site experiments. So basically everyone in the village, so this will be one of the first experiments that really, aside from Dauphin, gives everyone in a certain community access to a basic income. So not only are you looking at these individual effects, but you're also looking at the residual effects, right? How does a whole community change when you make sure everyone has stability and security? You know, what impact does that have on crime rates? What impact does that have on societal relationships, on community work that's going on? So it's a really exciting pilot because I think, you know, some of the experiments that have been in developing countries, it's hard to sometimes extrapolate like the impact of, you know, $100 where that gets you a motorcycle where you didn't have access to transportation versus that impact like somewhere in the Bay Area or in the US, right? But these community-wide effects are something that, you know, we're pretty confident we can use to really understand the impact anywhere in the world.
So let's talk, before we go to the audience for their questions and comments. You mentioned at the outset that in the 60s there was actually legislation that almost made it through the U.S. Congress. What spurred that on, and why did it almost make it? I mean, I would imagine you tell people that and they would say, here in the United States, you mean this country?
Well, if you think back to the administration under Johnson and how many anti-poverty efforts were underway, at that point, it was much more reasonable to think about some big changes. There was a number of factors that ultimately led to not being able to enact legislation there. I think one was you were starting to see that gulf between the left and right on views on what a safety net should look like. And so on the left, people thought the amount that was proposed was not sufficient. On the right, they thought it was too much. And so at the end of the day, there wasn't enough common ground to ultimately be able to make something happen, which is actually why I think that one of the challenges with basic income is because it is so far outside of the political space, you end up, that exists today, you get some very different people talking about the idea, including people on the right, those who would like to see a much simpler social safety net and rather have just cash. And so I think that for us, we feel like it is important when we talk about the policy to really ground it in the values that we're trying to achieve,
Uh-huh.
and saying that we really think that we need to abolish poverty. We need to ensure that we are providing people with a system that gives them the economic mobility to be able to achieve success no matter where they come from in life. And so making sure that as we talk about the policy, we're really communicating what it aims to solve. And so once we get to the point of legislation, we know what we're actually fighting for.
Yeah. So your group, the Universal Income Project, your goal is to spread the word, basically, because so many people don't understand what this concept is. Talk about your project a little bit and what you do and how you see the way forward to get there from here, especially in our current political situation, which has gotten so much worse since the late 60s when a lot of this actually started, like these narratives about welfare and stuff. So what's your plan? How are you going to get us there?
Well, you know, I think particularly considering this sort of current administration and state of Congress, one thing that we've really been looking at over the last year is the potential to experiment with different policies that might move us towards basic income on a state and local level. There's been a couple of really interesting initiatives that have come through even over the last 10 months. One that I find fascinating is in Hawaii. The state legislature there has been looking at this question of the future of work, right? What is going to happen over the next 20 years? And so they've convened a bipartisan council, Democrats and Republicans, the Chamber of Commerce, and union leaders to consider this question together. And what they've decided is that no matter what, they have decided that it's the responsibility of the Hawaiian government to ensure financial security for all Hawaiian families. And I think that that's an incredible statement, right? Because that's a commitment of theirs to pursue programs like universal basic income to ensure that no matter, no one can tell the future, right? But at least we have programs in place to ensure that whatever transition we may endure is smoother, right? That people have the flexibility and the kind of programs in place to make sure that they can weather however this job market might change.
Yeah, I think there's pretty much consensus that work is going to be changing in the future, and we don't know what the impacts are
Right.
going to be, but that's a lot of what's driving this renewed interest in universal basic income, right?
And we're looking at, are there more immediate policies that are similar to basic income that might be stepping stones that can help provide people with some extra stability? Because as SANDYHA mentioned earlier, when talking about the changing nature of work, that is not a future scenario. We've been experiencing that
Yes.
for decades now.
Yeah.
And the situation that most people are in now is far less stable than it's been in the past. And so can we be starting to move in that direction and providing perhaps not a full basic income, but a smaller universal dividend program that could give people a little bit extra stability so that they knew they would always have that to count on if their employment situation is changing and the amount that they are bringing in is varying per month.
Kind of like what Alaska does with the oil profits. Everybody in the state shares some of that dividend. What dividends would these be that you're talking about?
I think that is a big question right now as to what actually makes sense. Well, Alaska is obviously a special case, and not every state would be able to fund a substantial dividend from oil extraction. But if you look at...
we don't want actually to be encouraging oil extraction.
One common proposal is to look at a carbon dividend, so have some sort of fee and trade system where you're providing a tax on carbon, which first helps to reduce carbon emissions, which is good from an environmental perspective, but then the incoming revenue from that, rather than just using it to fund other programs, you could say, we're going to take this money and give it back equally to everyone. That is a recognition that we, in a given state or in a given country eventually, are all sharing the air, that this is a collective resource, and so the funds from that belong to everyone. And once you start down that path, you can then talk about, well, what are all the other things that we either collectively own or that we have really collectively built and generate, and how can we ensure that as people are profiting off that, a share of that is going back to the people.
Yeah, like the people who are going to go in and start drilling in the Bears Ears National Monument, right? So back to your universal income project. I notice on your website you do something called create-a-thons.
We do.
They sound like fun. What are they?
So this was something, this is really our very first project when we started the organization. It was an effort to really bring a bunch of advocates and people who are interested in basic income together and provide them a space in which to be able to explore different ways of pushing forward advocacy or education, right? So it was, what we decided was that we wanted to take all of these technologists and writers and artists and filmmakers, put them in a room for 2 days, right? And say, okay, let's think of creative projects that can help educate folks about this idea, right? Or let's think of ways
Because that really
in
is
which
step one. It's
Yeah.
why I wanted to do this program. I've been
Yep.
reading about universal basic income and thinking, how many people know about this?
And you know what's amazing about basic income is all of this potential that it unleashes, right? What's interesting to me is that Sam Altman, the head of Y Combinator, talks about how when he went through that accelerator program, he was a 20-year-old kid with an idea, right? And somebody gave him $12,000, and off of that, he was able to start a company, get fabulously wealthy and do the kind of work that he does today. But he always talks about, how stressful being poor was, right?
Yeah.
And, having to sort of rely on his family and friends to help support his work. And what we talk about with basic income is what are the ways in which there's all this untapped potential, right? All of these people who we could support to make sure that they can, do incredible creative work. So that's what we wanted to kind of create a microcosm of with the Create-a-thons, was to give folks a space to think creatively about how to advocate for a really transformational and inspirational policy. And the results were super exciting. We had, I think, over a dozen projects come out of the first one. There was a film. There was a crowdfunding project. What else?
It's been a while now.
There was
We had a couple documentary efforts.
Yeah, and there was a blockchain effort to allow groups, like community groups of people up to 100, to crowdfund their own basic income or to group fund their own basic income.
Interesting.
Yeah, which is really cool, right? So it's a
Your
piece
own
of software.
experiment. Yeah.
Exactly. That would
Yeah.
allow you and all of your friends to say, okay, we want to contribute to a group basic income. So.
Yeah. And have you, do you deal with any elected officials, either at a city or state level? And what can you tell us about where some of our California electeds stand on this?
There's definitely been more interest over the last year amongst elected officials in the idea. This last summer, we engaged on a legislative effort actually to do a carbon dividend in the state here. State Senator Bob Wieckowski had proposed legislation that would have extended California's cap and trade system, but first made it much more aggressive in helping to ramp down greenhouse gas emissions. And second, taking the majority of that revenue and actually creating what he called a carbon dividend, climate dividend fund here in the state that would have paid out to all state residents.
We have something like that now, right? Don't we get some kind of credit on our PG&E
There's
bill
a
that
utility
comes-
bill rebate, but
Yeah.
it's just to people who happen to be paying through that system.
Yeah.
It's also hard to find, and that's part of the.
And it's not all that much either. I know
It's not all that
knocks
much
some
either,
money
yeah.
off my bill once a year or something.
But part of the importance of the dividend is to make it visible, so people understand that this is something they're getting because they are a resident.
Here in California, we have oil drilling, especially down in the south. Do the people of California get any kind of dividend out of that, or we're just giving it away? I
If
don't
it is,
think
it's
we
not
do.
much.
Yeah, I don't think we do. Okay, I want to get to our audience here and hear what they have to say. Anything else about your project? That do you have anything coming up that is exciting you, or?
Well, we're actually involved in a larger effort right now, but actually helping to organize a big progressive conference happening this next weekend, which is aiming to connect the fights of today that progressives across the states are engaged in with our long-term goals.
Yeah.
And so that's, I think, with all the bad things that are happening now, it's hard to take a step back and think about where do we really want to be going. And so aiming to create a space here in order to have some of those conversations
Yeah.
and see how the work we're doing really connects with each other.
Especially at times like this, long-term planning kind of takes a back seat to the screaming, tearing your hair out every morning at the morning headlines. All right, let's get our audience in on this, and if you don't know the routine, wait till Crystal arrives with a microphone, and if you would stand up and make it easier on our camera folks, we'd appreciate it.
There used to be a slogan, from each according to their need, to each according to their ability, to each according to their need. And you seem to have abandoned that second part, that you're giving everybody the same, independent of their need. And needs are very, very different. If you only go over, say, geographically, the need for basic whatever in Iowa is quite different than it is in San Francisco by quite a big amount. If you have a young person, for example, who has parents and they have a room in their parents' house versus someone who's doesn't have any parents, or the parents don't have a big house, very different needs. So right now we have a system which provides somewhat according to needs. There's food stamps, there's housing subsidies, and there's one other, subsidies of medical care. So you're abandoning all those systems which are need dependent and giving a fixed amount. Do you think those systems which are need dependent should be eliminated in favor of your fixed sum?
I think there's 2 points. First, I'm glad that you pointed out this question about how a basic income relates to the social safety net, right? This is what Jim was talking about earlier. I think it's important to note that every time we talk about a basic income, we're talking about a program that serves as a foundation for the social safety net, right? It's sort of a layer underneath to make sure that everyone can meet their basic needs, on top of which, of course, we still need programs like healthcare, but we need to make sure that we have programs like disability, programs that are making sure that people can still have affordable housing, right? This is not a program that solves all of our problems by any means, but it's a program that solves one of the ones that makes every other problem more complicated, right? So it's a lot easier to tackle housing issues, transportation issues, education issues, when we know that everyone has enough money to meet their basic needs. So I think that's one point. The second is a great question, and it's like, why wouldn't we create a means-targeted program, right? And my perspective is this, that we have a lot of great programs that are means targeted. But one of the problems is this narrative, right? This narrative around welfare. And it's a racialized narrative about what those people that receive government benefits, who they are and what they do and why they aren't deserving, right? And I think that is one of the issues that you consistently run into when you choose certain characteristics and decide to give people special assistance because of those characteristics. It's very easy, and we've seen this widening gap over time, for us to basically like other those people, right? That's one of the problems, and I think my perspective on this is that we have the wealth to ensure that covering your basic needs is a right? No American should go without the ability to put food on the table, clothes on their back. And so let's make sure that that's an absolute guarantee for everyone. We can make sure that the way that we pay for it is primarily through taxing incomes, held wealth, right? We can ensure that this is a program that makes sure that more people actually get access to the wealth that we have. But this should be a guarantee that no matter what, if you don't make the money or you don't have it, you can meet your basic needs. Yeah. Anything to add?
Nothing to add to that? Okay.
Yes. So but you say basic needs, and that means food, shelter, medical care, housing. And So you'd basically meet those basic needs with this guaranteed income, and there'd be no need for food stamps, housing subsidies, or any of those other programs, because basic needs, which are those ones I mentioned, will be met with this guaranteed income. Is that correct?
So no, there's different proposals for how one might approach a basic income. When we talk about it, we're talking about it as a new program that is not replacing anything else. This would not be a substitute for the programs that exist today. This would be something on top of that. And so if we establish basic income and we see down the road that some of those programs are not important anymore, if we're giving people enough money and it turns out that we don't need food stamps, for example, then fine, we can talk about a change there. But what we're talking about is not a replacement. We're talking about an enhancement on what we have right now. And so as SANDYHA mentioned, we see that as as a backbone to what the social safety net of the future could be. We will still need things on top of that. We're not going to touch medical coverage. Medical coverage it's not going to be covered through basic income. Other things that a cash payment every month doesn't adequately handle would still be addressed separately. This just gives us a floor that we know is always there.
Okay, any more hands up front here? Well, okay, this side first.
Yeah, this is a topic I've been interested in and writing about for a couple of years, and to this point of how to fund a basic income and avoid this. I mean, it seems like most of the proposals are some sort of a wealth transfer of taxing the people who've earned it and given it to those who haven't. And it seems like that whole process could be avoided if the basic income were paid for with a complementary currency that's founded on some different principles. And it's too complicated to summarize in a minute, but I'm hoping maybe I could meet with you guys at some point in the future and run the idea by you.
Sure. I think we've heard some interesting proposals for either local alternative currencies as something that could either enact or supplement a program for a basic income.
The basic income would be paid in the local currency?
There was actually a very interesting proposal for a candidate for mayor in Detroit who ran in the primary earlier this year, where she wanted to enact a city-level basic income and to pay half of it through normal taxation and payments and half of it through a local Detroit currency. She didn't end up winning, but that was her proposal.
Did she get a lot of votes?
I don't know what the count was in the end.
Interesting idea. Crystal, next one's up here in the front row again, on this side.
I think there's a way to fund your goal with no increase in taxes. It's politically difficult. What this would be is to shut down the biggest fraud going in our federal government currently, which is the military, industrial, congressional complex. It's been going since the 1950s. I confess I helped design the first piece of it, and then in the process discovered it was a fraud. That fact was classified secret, so that if anybody talked about it, you go to jail. And now, this many years later, nobody talks about it still. But that system didn't work. It gave birth to dozens of systems that do not work, that are funded through industrial bribes. They're called campaign contributions to politicians, and then the cooperation of the military to then buy the construction from the crooks. And this is going strong. The first system was SAGE Air Defense System. It was the biggest fraud of the 20th century, cost hundreds of billions of dollars, even though it never worked and never could have worked. And today we have anti-ballistic missile systems that also don't work, never will work, being deployed around the world. And this program goes on and on. If you could just convert it, you'd have all the money you need.
Tearing down the military-industrial congressional, as he properly notes, complex would be an excellent idea, I think. That's one of the things we try to work on at the Peace and Justice Center. I guess related in some way, I'd follow up on that by asking, are there business leaders who are supportive of this idea? Because one of the things about a basic income is as we shift into this new workplace experience in the future, people who are selling things need customers with money to buy those things. And I would think a lot of businesses would see a certain amount of self-interest in backing a basic income. Is that true? Are there corporate interests that are interested in exploring this idea? Defense contractors aren't, because they don't sell their stuff to us, but...
There are a number of individual corporate leaders that have expressed interest in basic income. The majority of them are concentrated in the tech sector. I think just because, going back to why is this a conversation today, they've been thinking about these questions of, what if, the most extreme case of automation that we can imagine happened?
The robot apocalypse.
Sure, right? So what would we do in that case? So I think they've just spent a lot more time considering this far future scenario, and so they are primarily the ones that have been talking about this effort. But I think you're starting to see, just a lot of folks across, business and political spectrums talk about it. For example, it was a couple months ago that Keith Ellison, the popular, super progressive Minnesota congressman, tweeted, "I'm in favor of a universal basic income." So you're really starting to see this sort of penetration among leaders in different sectors.
Anything to add to that in terms of businesses getting on board?
I think that's right. I think there are definitely people in at least certain businesses space that are interested in the idea. I do think that it can make the conversation complicated because it gets back to the question of what problem are you trying to solve with the policy? And so I think that there's rightfully some mistrust that if it's business leaders who become the ones driving the conversation, that the policy we end up with is really one that empowers people. And so that's why for us it's been so important to make sure that we are very much reaching out and bringing in voices of the people who are affected, considering this from a racial justice perspective, considering it from an anti-poverty perspective, and making sure that the people who are directly impacted by that are having a voice in what is the ultimate solution that we want.
Yeah, I think that's probably a wise choice because it's not a real good selling point to help Apple keep selling $1,000 phones, All right, another question here.
There are a significant number of people in this country in the current political social paradigm that feel that there is a large number of their fellow citizens that don't deserve an income support, that they have to work for it. And on your last point about the business leaders, the visionaries, if we can call them that are supporting a basic income at the higher management levels of our corporations, are viewed skeptically that there is an ulterior motive for this. So does your education plan does it address these issues?
So I think you named two different questions there, or two different points there, right? One is that many view tech leaders skeptically when they say, we think that this is the social policy that will fix things. I think there are several reasons for that. I think, to some degree that's valid. But I think that the more interesting question that you point out is this question about work, right? And how we all feel about work. And I think it's one of the reasons that basic income is it's like a topic that inspires a lot of passion for people, because it really gets to the heart of what we consider to be, like, whether we think that the way that our economy works today is the way it should work, right? So you have to get a job, you have to do a work that is like monetarily valued, and that's the way that you'll get enough money to sustain yourself, right? And we know that there are lots of types of work, being a parent, caregiving, doing all sorts of community volunteering work, creative work, that isn't always funded to the degree that we want it to, right? So there's this really distinction between like paying jobs and work. And I think that's one of the conversations, the way that we get to a basic income is by having conversations with other Americans about this question, right? Is like, how do we properly value work, or how do we make sure that people can support themselves while doing important work?
Yeah, I think that there's what ties all that together is that question of deservedness as to who in our society do we feel should be lifted out of poverty and should have a chance at success in life. And I think that's where, if you can be explicit from the start in saying what you're aiming to do there, I think it can effectively communicate what your underlying intentions are. And so when we say, like, we want everyone to actually have a chance to have a good life in this country, regardless of where they're coming from, that says what sort of policy that we're aiming to design here.
I think the question gets back at what is probably the biggest problem with bringing forward an idea like this is, and we've talked about it already, it's this narrative about if you don't have a job, it's because you're lazy and you're just willing to take the government handouts. We hear that constantly, all the time. And the narrative needs to change to, why is there poverty in this country? What structurally is there about our economy that ensures that we have a certain percentage in abject poverty all the time? When we have an economy where 5% of the people are unemployed, and that's considered full employment.
Right.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a condition we take for granted. And
Yeah.
what's so interesting is that people often conflate the idea of basic income with no work, right? That if you support a policy like basic income, it must mean that you don't want people to have jobs or to work. And I find that interesting because I think it gets back to this question of, like, how are we making sure that people can support themselves, right? Like, we believe that basic income is a policy that frees people up to do more and better work, right? If you think about the kind of research in science that often isn't funded as well, it's research into trying to find medicines for diseases that affect a small
number,
portion of
yeah.
people, because it's like not as
There's no-
monetizable. Or it's like random research into some strange worm, right? That it's often research like that that leads to discoveries way down the road that you never could have predicted, right? But it's that kind of just sort of expanding the bounds of human knowledge kind of research that has made so much of what we have today possible, right? And that's the kind of work that we conflate with, jobs that pay you, right? That's the kind of work that we hope programs like basic income can free people up to do.
And it's also, I think this is particularly relevant here, but opening up entrepreneurship to more people. Right now, there's this myth amongst many people in Silicon Valley that anyone can go out and start a company. But if you look at who actually can do it, it's generally people who have a lot of wealth to start with.
Yeah.
Or have family connections that allow them to support themselves while they try their crazy idea. If instead we're saying everyone can take the time to try out their crazy idea, sure, maybe 9 out of 10 don't go anywhere, but all those people that are being forced into minimum wage jobs just to get by now, some of them probably have great ideas for what could be a new, exciting business or invention in our society.
Yeah, there was a report, I think, in the New York Times just this past week about how your zip code creates or destroys opportunity, and that the country is missing out on a lot of Einsteins because of the way things are structured. I think one of the most interesting things is going back to what you said about Manitoba and discovering that where it did impact employment, where people were leaving the workforce, they were doing so to stay in school, which is certainly a valid form of work that benefits society greatly, or staying home to have to raise the kids with parents present instead of both parents working 2 or 3 jobs to get by. Okay, quickly, a couple of minutes. Sorry, I didn't see you back there.
Just sort of carrying on your theme, one of the aspects of society that I think this can challenge is the idea that in business or entrepreneurship, there's always the desire to grow and get bigger. And I think with a basic income like this, people could be small farmers and make organic products locally and not have to bring them from way, or could sew clothing and not have to bring them in from China. And there are just thousands of ways that you could be more local.
All right. I'll give you each 20 seconds to wrap up, and where do we go from here? Or what's the hope?
I mean, I think ultimately we need to be thinking bigger about what we can do. I think it can be really hard to do that given how many attacks we're facing right now, but I think now more than ever we need to be thinking about what is our North Star for where we want to be aiming, and actually starting to work now to move towards that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. We have to challenge ourselves and our communities to really have these conversations about where we want to go and make sure we're keeping that in mind as we continue to push for policies that we want to see today.
Yeah. I want to thank Jim PUGH and SANDYHA ANANTHARAMAN of the Universal Income Project, universalincome.org. And I think this is something we're going to be pursuing a little bit more. It's a fascinating idea and opens up, at the very least, a lot of conversations about how we're structuring our economy and society right now. You've been watching Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. Thanks for watching. Thanks for tuning in. Thank you all in the audience here for coming. And thanks to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.